That thing, she began, her voice a grating symphony of entitlement that scraped against the placid afternoon air, is an unregistered alteration to the community's visual perimeter. I followed the line of her accusing finger, which was tipped with a nail painted a particularly violent shade of fuchsia. It pointed not at my house, not at my fence, but at a single magnificent heirloom tomato plant, a brandywine that had been my late father's pride and joy, its lineage in our family stretching back 3 generations. The plant was heavy with green fruit, basking in the late summer sun. Or it had been, until a moment ago. Now its main stem was bent at a sickening angle, its roots violently exposed from the rich, dark soil of my garden. The instrument of this horticultural violence, a squat, wheezing bulldog named Winston, was currently digging with frantic glee at another bed, sending clods of my carefully amended soil flying. Its owner, the source of the grating voice, stood on the other side of my simple split-rail fence, a solid 2 feet inside her own property line. Her name was Karen Miller, and she was the newly elected president of the estates at Whispering Creek Homeowners Association, a title she wore with the gravity of a field marshal commanding a continental army. "My dog," she continued, completely ignoring Winston's ongoing rampage, "is naturally drawn to disorganized, overgrown areas. Your garden," she said the word as if it were a particularly vile epithet, "is an attractive nuisance. According to Section 12, subsection C of the Community Covenants, all landscaping visible from common areas must adhere to the approved palette of manicured shrubbery. This wild patch is a clear violation." I remained silent, my hands resting on the smooth, weathered wood of a fence post my grandfather had set into the earth 70 years ago. My gaze shifted from the ruined brandywine to Winston, then back to the ample figure of Karen Miller. She was clad in a turquoise polo shirt stretched taut across her torso, the vaguely fascistic logo of the HOA, a stylized eagle clutching a manicured topiary, straining at the seams. "Furthermore," she pressed on, puffing up with the self-importance of a petty tyrant, "your property's lack of conformity is dragging down the entire neighborhood's property values. We have standards to maintain. I'm issuing you a formal warning. You have 14 days to clear this entire patch and replace it with approved sod and boxwoods. If you fail to comply, we will begin levying fines of $100 per day." A slow, dangerous calm began to settle over me, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced since my final tour, a cold clarity that pushed aside the hot flare of initial anger. This was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. My property, all 50 acres of it, was never part of the estates at Whispering Creek. My family had owned this land since the late 1800s. The original stone farmhouse, which I had painstakingly restored, sat a quarter-mile back from the fence line, nestled among ancient oaks. This garden, the orchard behind it, the spring-fed pond shimmering in the distance, they were my inheritance, my sanctuary, the place I had come to decompress after 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. The subdivision was the interloper, a beige tide of vinyl siding and monotonous landscaping that had lapped up against the shores of my peaceful kingdom just 3 years prior. I finally spoke, my voice low and even, stripped of any emotion. "Your dog is on my property." Karen blinked, the flow of her bureaucratic tirade momentarily interrupted. "He's just being a dog. It's your responsibility to ensure your property line doesn't invite exploration." "He has destroyed my property," I continued, my eyes locking onto hers. "And you are threatening to fine me for violations of a covenant that holds no jurisdiction over my land. You are mistaken on every single point of fact and law." "I am the president of the HOA!" she shrieked, her voice climbing an octave. The sudden shrillness startled Winston, who paused his digging to look back at her. "My authority is absolute within the boundaries of this community, and your unkempt fence line is part of those boundaries." She was wrong. The fence was mine. The land was mine. Her authority ended precisely where my property began. But I knew, with the certainty of a man who had studied countless adversaries, that arguing with her now would be like trying to reason with a hurricane. It was a force of nature, driven by ego and ignorance. I simply nodded slowly. "I see." I retrieved my phone from my pocket, held it up, and took several clear, well-composed photographs. Winston in the act of destruction, the ruined tomato plant, the broader scene, clearly showing the fence line and Karen standing behind it, her face contorted in a sneer. "Take all the pictures you want. They won't help you when the fines start piling up. Winston, come." She gave a sharp tug on the retractable leash she had been holding, its cord fully extended and limp. The dog ignored her. With an exasperated sigh, she stomped over, clipped the leash onto his collar, and hauled the panting animal away from my violated garden bed. As she retreated toward her identical beige house, she threw one last shot over her shoulder. "You'll be hearing from our management company." I watched her go, the turquoise polo receding into the sea of manicured lawns. I looked down at the savaged earth, at the broken stem of a plant that held more history and integrity in its fibrous tissues than Karen Miller possessed in her entire being. The hot anger was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline purpose. She had chosen the battleground. I would choose the terms of engagement. I spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the damage. I photographed every broken stem, every uprooted plant, every pile of displaced soil. I measured the depth of the holes Winston had dug. I wrote down the time of the incident, Karen's exact words as I recalled them, and a detailed description of her and her dog. I treated the garden bed as a crime scene, because in a very real sense, it was. It was a violation not just of my property, but of the peace I had worked my entire life to earn. That evening, I went into my study. It was a room of quiet order, filled with books on engineering, history, and horticulture. I bypassed the shelves and went to my supply closet. From it, I took a heavy-duty 3-ring binder with a clear plastic cover. I pulled out a fresh sheet of label paper and typed 2 words onto it, printing it in a simple, bold, black font: Operation Verdant Fury. I slid the label into the binder's spine. This was how I operated. Every major project in the Corps, from building a forward operating base to repairing a hurricane-ravaged levee system, began with a plan, a binder, a code name. It imposed order on chaos. It turned an emotional reaction into a methodical campaign. The first documents to go into the binder were the photographs I had taken, each one printed in high resolution and slipped into a clear sheet protector. Behind them, I placed my typewritten notes from the encounter, a document I labeled Exhibit A, Initial Engagement. Karen Miller believed this was a simple neighborhood dispute. She thought she was dealing with some retired old man she could bully into submission. She had no idea that she had just declared war on a man who had spent 3 decades planning and executing complex logistical and strategic operations. She was bringing a list of rules to a battle of wits, will, and overwhelming preparation. It was a fatal miscalculation. The official declaration of war arrived 4 days later. It came in a stiff, cream-colored envelope, the kind of paper designed to convey an unearned sense of importance. in the top left corner, the HOA's vaguely fascistic eagle was embossed in gold foil. The letter itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. It was addressed to current resident at my address, the first sign of its impersonal, indiscriminate hostility. It listed 3 separate violations. Violation 1. Failure to adhere to approved landscaping palette, Covenant 12.c, citing my vegetable garden as unregulated agricultural activity. Violation 2. Improper maintenance of perimeter fencing, Covenant 9a, claiming my historic split-rail fence was dilapidated and not in line with the community standard of white vinyl. Violation 3. Creation of an attractive nuisance, Community Guideline 15F, referencing the claim that my garden had lured her dog into a state of natural excitement. Each violation carried a fine of $100 for a total of $300. A note at the bottom, printed in an aggressive red font, stated that the fines would accrue on a daily basis if the non-compliant issues were not remediated within 14 days. The letter was signed, not by Karen Miller, but by a compliance officer from a third-party property management company, a hired gun designed to create a buffer of corporate anonymity. I read the letter twice, a grim smile touching my lips. It was even better than I had hoped. It was arrogant, overreaching, and based on a foundation of pure fiction. They had put their flawed strategy in writing. They had given me ammunition. I 3-hole punched the envelope and the letter, slid them into a sheet protector, and placed them in the binder behind Exhibit A. This became Exhibit B, the paper assault. My campaign was officially underway. The first phase of any operation is reconnaissance. Know your enemy and know the terrain. My enemy was Karen Miller and the HOA board. The terrain was the thick booklet of covenants, conditions, and restrictions I had been given as a courtesy when the subdivision was first built. I had filed it away, never imagining I would need to read it. Now, I retrieved it from my filing cabinet and began to dissect it, page by page, with a red pen and a yellow highlighter. It was a tedious document, filled with legalese and petty restrictions designed to enforce a crushing, soul-destroying uniformity. No basketball hoops visible from the street. Garbage cans must be stored out of sight. Holiday decorations could only be displayed within a specific, narrow window of dates. It was a blueprint for a life of quiet desperation, policed by the bored and the power-hungry. I wasn't looking for rules to follow. I was looking for weaknesses. I found several. The covenants were poorly written, full of ambiguous language and internal contradictions. More importantly, I found the section defining the boundaries of the association's jurisdiction. It referred explicitly and repeatedly to the properties described in the final plat map filed with the county registrar. This was the key. My property was not on that map. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse. The registrar's office was a dusty, quiet place that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic patience. I requested the plat maps for the estates at Whispering Creek. A helpful clerk wheeled out a massive book, and together we found the relevant page. There it was, in crisp, black and white surveyor's lines. The entire subdivision, with every lot, every common area, every easement clearly delineated. And there, bordering its northern edge, was a large, unlabeled parcel of land. My land. A thick, solid line separated the two, a line labeled Property Line. Herein ends the jurisdiction of the Whispering Creek development. It was a kill shot. A definitive, legally binding document that rendered Karen Miller's entire argument null and void. I had a high-resolution digital copy made and printed several glossy, full-color copies back at my study. They went into the binder as Exhibit C, the terrain map. But I wasn't done. An enemy rarely attacks on only one front. I needed to understand the full scope of her operational capabilities. I shifted my intelligence gathering from legal documents to human sources. It was time to build a resistance. I began by taking slow, deliberate walks through the neighborhood at different times of day. I was no longer just the strange old man who lived in the farmhouse behind the trees. I was an observer, a field agent gathering intel. I saw the small acts of defiance. A garden gnome quickly hidden as Karen's golf cart approached, a flag taken down just before the deadline. I saw the signs of oppression, the empty driveways devoid of basketball hoops, the identical HOA-approved wreaths on every door. The air itself felt thick with a low-grade fear of non-compliance. My first contact was an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable. I'd seen Karen berating her a week earlier over a flock of pink plastic flamingos arranged artfully in her petunia bed. I found her weeding her flower beds, her movements slow and careful. I introduced myself and complimented her prize-winning roses. "They're lovely," she said, her voice a fragile, papery thing. "But Karen says they're not on the approved floral list." Can you imagine? A list for flowers. I listened patiently as her story tumbled out. It was a litany of petty tyrannies. Fines for her flamingos, warnings about the color of her welcome mat, a notice that her bird feeder was attracting undesirable avian elements. She was a widow, living on a fixed income, and the constant threat of fines terrified her. She paid them without argument, just to be left alone. I asked her if she would be willing to let me make copies of the violation notices she had received. She hesitated, fear warring with a flicker of defiance in her tired eyes. "What good would it do?" she whispered. "You can't fight them." "One person can't," I said gently. "But a pattern of behavior is a powerful tool. All I'm asking for is information. I will handle the rest." She eventually agreed, retrieving a shoebox filled with the cream-colored envelopes. As I scanned the documents later that day, I saw the pattern immediately. Vague violations, inconsistent enforcement, and a steady stream of revenue from the most vulnerable residents. Mrs. Gable's testimony and documents became Exhibit D, Pattern of Harassment, Elderly. My next target was the Martinez family, a young couple with 2 small children. Their crime had been a portable basketball hoop. I found Mr. Martinez in his garage, staring glumly at the dismantled hoop. I struck up a conversation about the upcoming school year, and soon he was venting his frustration. "We moved here for the kids," he said, gesturing with a wrench. "Good schools, safe streets, but we can't do anything. We got a notice that the hoop had to be stored out of sight unless it was in active use. My son, he's 8. He leaves it out for an hour after school, and boom, there's a violation notice in the mail. We got 3 of them. $300 for a basketball hoop. We just gave up." He told me about other families who had been fined for swing sets, for sidewalk chalk art, for the wrong shade of beige on their shutters. It was a war on joy, a campaign to crush any spark of individuality. He too provided me with copies of his violation notices. They became Exhibit E, Pattern of Harassment, Families. I now had a binder thick with evidence. I had legal proof of my exemption, and I had documented a clear pattern of predatory and selective enforcement against other residents. But this was still just defense. It was time to go on the offensive. It was time to bring in professional reinforcements. I had a friend from my days in the Corps, a man who had been the chief legal counsel for our entire division. I called him, explained the situation in precise, unemotional terms, and asked for a recommendation. He gave me a name without hesitation. David Chen, he said. Marine JAG, retired. Got out as a major, eats HOAs for breakfast. Tell him I sent you. He'll appreciate your prep work. David Chen's office was in a sleek, modern building downtown, a world away from the beige conformity of the estates at Whispering Creek. He was a small, whip-thin man with an intensity in his eyes that I recognized immediately. It was the look of a man who enjoyed the hunt. I didn't give him a long, rambling story. I simply placed the binder, Operation Verdant Fury, on his polished mahogany desk and opened it to the first page. Your initial engagement occurred at 1400 hours, 4 days ago, I began. Here is the photographic evidence of the incursion and property damage. I walked him through the binder, exhibit by exhibit. The initial confrontation, the paper assault, the terrain map from the county registrar, the pattern of harassment against Mrs. Gable and the Martinezes. I presented it not as a homeowner with a grievance, but as a field officer briefing his commander. Chen listened intently, his expression shifting from professional interest to something approaching predatory glee. He picked up the glossy print of the plat map, holding it like a holy relic. "Colonel," he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "This isn't a case. This is a kill box. You've built them a perfect kill box." He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen on the desk. "They have no jurisdiction. None. That makes their violation notices not just invalid, but a form of harassment and attempted extortion. Their selective enforcement against the elderly and families with children could open them up to a discrimination lawsuit. And the president, this Karen Miller, bringing her animal onto your property to cause damage, that's straight-up trespass and destruction of property. We can file a civil suit against her personally for the damages." "What's our first move?" I asked. "We send a letter," he said, his eyes gleaming. "But not a polite one. We send a tactical nuke of a letter. We'll cite the specific state statutes they're violating. We'll attach the plat map. We'll reference your documented evidence of her personal torts against you. We'll put the entire board on notice that they are personally, jointly, and severally liable for any further harassment, and that we will pursue all available legal remedies, including punitive damages. We won't just ask them to cease and desist. We'll demand a written apology and full restitution for your damaged garden." He paused, leaning forward. "Here's the beauty of it. An intelligent opponent would retreat, apologize, and pray we go away. But a petty tyrant like this? She'll see it as a challenge. She'll escalate. And when she does, she'll walk right into the kill box you've prepared." I felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over me. For the first time, I felt like I was on solid ground, with heavy artillery backing me up. I was 10 feet tall. David Chen's letter was a work of art. It was printed on the heaviest bond paper I had ever felt, and the language was so dense with legal threat and righteous indignation that I imagined it might spontaneously combust on Karen Miller's desk. It was sent via certified mail to every single member of the HOA board, at their personal addresses. A copy was also sent to the property management company. The letter laid out our case in brutal, methodical detail. It explicitly stated that any attempt to enter my property, levy fines, or otherwise harass me would be met with immediate legal action, seeking damages far in excess of the value of my entire garden. It concluded by demanding a payment of $500 to cover the cost of the destroyed heirloom plants, the damaged soil, and my time. It was a bill she could not laugh off. Then, we waited. In warfare, this is often the most difficult phase. The quiet after you've launched your first salvo, waiting to see the enemy's response. For 10 days, there was nothing. No response to the letter. No new violation notices in my mailbox. A fragile peace seemed to settle over the neighborhood. I saw the Martinez boy shooting hoops in his driveway again. Mrs. Gable's flamingos were back in her petunias. I began to wonder if, perhaps, Chen had misjudged our adversary. Maybe the sheer force of the legal threat had been enough to force a retreat. I was wrong. The tyrant was simply regrouping for a new attack. The counter-assault came in the form of another cream-colored envelope. This one, however, was not a violation notice. It was a summons. I was being called to appear before the HOA's Architectural Review Committee for a formal compliance hearing regarding my unapproved agricultural installation. They had completely ignored the jurisdictional issue, the trespass, the property damage. They were doubling down, attempting to drag me onto their turf, to subject me to their kangaroo court. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, to be held in the community clubhouse. They had ignored the nuclear missile and responded with a strongly worded memo. It was a breathtaking act of arrogant stupidity. I scanned the summons and immediately forwarded it to Chen. His reply was succinct. "It's a trap, but not for you, for them. I'll be there. Let them dig their own graves." But Karen wasn't content to wait for the hearing. 3 days before the scheduled date, she made her biggest blunder yet. I was in my workshop sharpening my gardening tools when I heard the rumble of a heavy truck coming down my long gravel driveway. This was unusual. I wasn't expecting any deliveries. I walked out to the porch and saw a large landscaping truck, the logo of Miller's Lawn and Garden Excellence emblazoned on its side, coming to a halt near the fence line. 2 men got out. One of them began unspooling a string trimmer. The other approached my porch, a clipboard in his hand. Karen Miller's golf cart was parked just on the other side of my fence, and she sat in it, arms crossed, a smug look on her face. She had come to watch her victory. "Afternoon," the foreman said, though his tone was uncertain. "We've got a work order here to clear about 10 feet of brush and, vegetables along this fence line." I remained on my porch, my posture relaxed. "And who issued this work order?" "The HOA," he said, tapping the clipboard. "Lady over there said this is all community property that needs to be brought up to code." I nodded slowly. I went back inside for a moment and returned with 3 documents: my property deed, the county plat map, and a copy of David Chen's letter. I also brought the small digital camera I now kept handy. I turned it on and began recording. I walked down the steps and met the foreman at the edge of the lawn. "I'm afraid you've been given some bad information," I said calmly, handing him the documents. "This is my deed. This is the official county map showing my property is not part of the HOA. And this is a letter from my attorney putting the HOA on notice that anyone attempting to enter or alter my property is committing criminal trespass and destruction of property. That liability, I'm afraid, would extend to you and your company." The foreman's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. He was a working man, not a bureaucrat. He understood deeds and property lines. He looked from the map to Karen, then back to the legal letter in his hands. The phrase, "jointly and severally liable," seemed to jump out at him. "She told us this was a common area," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "She lied," I said simply. "If you or your men set 1 foot on my side of that fence, I will call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing." Then my lawyer will sue your company into bankruptcy. I don't want to do that. I suspect you're just trying to do your job, but you need to understand that your client has ordered you to commit a crime. I turned my gaze to Karen, who was now standing beside her golf cart, her face a mottled red. "Call them off, Karen," I said, my voice carrying easily across the lawn. "Call them off before you add conspiracy to commit trespass to your growing list of legal problems." "You can't talk to me like that," she shrieked. "They work for the HOA." "They work for a man who doesn't want to lose his business," I replied. The foreman had heard enough. He snatched the clipboard back, made a quick cut-it motion to his other worker, and got back in the truck. "Sorry for the trouble, mister," he said through the open window. "We're not getting involved in this." He backed the truck carefully down my driveway and was gone. Karen stood there, sputtering, her face a mask of pure fury. She had been publicly and humiliatingly defeated. Her smug little victory party was over. She glared at me, then at the camera I was still holding, and with a wordless scream of frustration, she jumped in her golf cart and sped away. I stopped recording. The entire encounter, from the truck's arrival to Karen's screeching departure, was now documented on video. I labeled the file Exhibit F, the failed incursion. Karen Miller had tried a direct assault, and it had failed spectacularly. She had exposed herself, proven her malicious intent beyond any doubt. The walls of her petty kingdom were beginning to crumble, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the final piece of intelligence I needed to bring the whole rotten structure down was about to fall into my lap. The call came 2 nights later. It was a blocked number. The voice on the other end was nervous, hesitant. "Is this Colonel Croft?" the man asked. "It is." "My name is Arthur Finch. I'm the treasurer for the Whispering Creek HOA. I remained silent, letting him talk. "I saw the invoice for that landscaping company," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Miller's Lawn and Garden Excellence. It's owned by her brother-in-law. She tried to get me to pay the full amount, even though they didn't do the work. She wanted to pay it out of the reserve fund. When I questioned it, she threatened me, said she'd have me removed from the board." He took a shaky breath. "I've been on this board for 5 years. It used to be about planning the community picnic. Now, it's just her. She bullies everyone. I saw the letter from your lawyer. I know you're fighting her. I think I can help." This was the moment. The inside source. The defector who holds the keys to the kingdom. "What kind of help, Mr. Finch?" I asked, my voice neutral. "The financials," he said, a new resolve in his voice. "She's been using the HOA's debit card like it's her own personal slush fund. Lavish dinners disguised as board meetings. Payments to vendors for services never rendered. She has a beautification fund that no one is allowed to see the receipts for. It's all there. I have the bank statements. I have the receipts she did submit. It's a clear pattern of embezzlement." We arranged to meet the next day in a coffee shop in the next town over. Arthur Finch was a small, balding man with the perpetually worried expression of an accountant who has seen too much. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "I made copies of everything from the last 2 years," he said. "I hope this is enough." I opened the envelope. It was more than enough. It was a detailed accounting of Karen Miller's greed and corruption. Hundreds of dollars for a strategic planning dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in the city, a $2,000 charge to a high-end nursery for common area enhancements that never appeared, and the invoices from her brother-in-law's company, inflated, vague, and recurring. It was the smoking gun. I looked up at Arthur Finch. The man was terrified, but he had done the right thing. He was a patriot in his own small way, a resistor against an occupying force. "You've done a great service to your community, Mr. Finch," I said. "Now let me put this information to good use." I took the documents back to my study. They became Exhibit G, the financials. Operation Verdant Fury was now complete. I had the legal high ground, a documented pattern of harassment, video evidence of a failed criminal act, and now irrefutable proof of financial corruption. The compliance hearing was the next evening. It was no longer a hearing I had to defend myself at. It was the final battleground I had been preparing for. It was the stage for a public takedown. I called David Chen and briefed him on the new intelligence. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Colonel," he finally said, his voice filled with awe, "you haven't just built a kill box. You've baited it, set the charges, and you're holding the detonator. Tomorrow night is going to be a fireworks show." The community clubhouse was a soulless, beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs and bad fluorescent lighting. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and quiet desperation. But tonight, it was packed. I had spent the afternoon on the phone. I called Mrs. Gable. I called the Martinezes. I called every resident who had been a victim of Karen's petty tyranny and told them that if they wanted to see a change, they needed to be at the meeting. They had come. The room was a sea of grim, determined faces. My insurgency was no longer a handful of scattered individuals. It was an army. Karen Miller sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by two of her sycophantic board members. Arthur Finch sat at the far end, looking pale but resolute. Karen banged a small, toy-like gavel on the table. "This special hearing of the Architectural Review Committee is now in session," she announced, her voice booming with unearned authority. "The first and only item on the agenda is the ongoing compliance failure at the property bordering our northern perimeter." She fixed her gaze on me. "Mr. Croft, you have been summoned to account for your violations." I stood up slowly. David Chen was seated beside me, his briefcase on his lap. All eyes in the room were on me. "My name is Colonel James Croft, retired," I began, my voice calm and clear, easily filling the room. "Before we discuss any alleged violations, I believe we first need to establish jurisdiction. According to the official plat maps filed with this county, my property is not, and has never been, part of the estates at Whispering Creek. Therefore, this committee, and the HOA itself, has absolutely no authority or jurisdiction over me or my property." I gestured to Chen, who stood and placed a large, foam-backed print of the plat map on an easel we had brought with us. The thick black line separating my property from the subdivision was impossible to miss. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face began to flush. "That is a procedural matter," she snapped. "We are here to discuss the visual blight your farm is inflicting on our community." "The only infliction on this community," I countered, my voice hardening, "has been your own campaign of harassment and intimidation, a campaign that began when you allowed your dog to enter my property and destroy my garden." I placed the large photos of the ruined plants on the easel next to the map. Another, louder murmur swept the room. "Lies!" Karen shouted, banging the gavel uselessly. "My Winston is a perfect gentleman." "A gentleman who was filmed in the act," I said, holding up my phone. "An act which was followed by a series of fraudulent and harassing violation notices. Notices, I have discovered, that are part of a much larger pattern." This was the signal. Mrs. Gable stood up, her voice trembling but clear. She fined me $400 because she doesn't like my flamingos. She called them tacky, Mr. Martinez stood next. She fined us $300 for a basketball hoop. She said it lowered the tone of the neighborhood. One by one, a dozen residents stood and told their stories. The fines, the threats, the endless stream of petty rules, selectively and vindictively enforced. With each story, the anger in the room grew, a palpable wave of resentment directed at the woman at the front table. Karen's face had gone from red to a pasty white. She was losing control. "This is not the proper forum for grievances," she yelled, her voice cracking. "We are here to discuss his violations." "We are here to discuss your violations, Karen," I said, my voice dropping, cutting through the noise. "Specifically, your financial violations." Arthur Finch, at the end of the table, took a deep breath and stood up. "As treasurer," he began, his voice gaining strength with every word, "I have a fiduciary duty to the members of this association, and I can no longer remain silent about the gross misuse of our funds by President Miller." David Chen calmly walked to the front of the room and connected a small projector to his laptop. The first image that flashed up on the wall behind Karen was a copy of the bank statement, with a highlighted charge for $700 at an upscale steakhouse. "Exhibit A," Chen said, his voice as sharp as a bayonet. "A board planning dinner, attended only by President Miller and her husband." He clicked to the next slide. "An invoice from Miller's Lawn and Garden Excellence for $5,000 for spring planting." "Exhibit B," Chen continued. "A contract awarded with no competing bids to a company owned by the president's brother-in-law for flowers that were never planted." He went on, slide after slide. The high-end nursery receipts, the consulting fees paid to a mysterious company that shared a mailing address with Karen's sister, the fuel charges on the HOA debit card that matched her family vacation dates. It was a methodical, undeniable vivisection of her corruption. The room was silent. The only sound the quiet click of the presentation remote and David Chen's precise, damning narration. When he was finished, he turned off the projector, and the room was plunged back into the harsh fluorescent light. Every single resident was staring at Karen Miller, their faces a mixture of shock and cold fury. She was trapped, exposed, defeated. "These are all lies, fabrications," she stammered, shuffling papers uselessly. "This meeting is adjourned." "Not so fast," David Chen said, holding up a hand. "Under the bylaws of this association, any member may make a motion from the floor during a special session." Mr. Martinez stood up, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "I move that we commission a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 3 years." "I second the motion," Mrs. Gable shouted from the back. "All in favor," Mr. Martinez called out. A forest of hands shot up. A thunderous "Aye" shook the room. "The motion carries," Chen said with grim satisfaction. But they weren't finished. A woman I didn't know, from the other side of the neighborhood, stood up. "I move for a vote of no confidence in President Karen Miller and the immediate removal of her and her appointed board members." A dozen voices screamed, "Second!" "All in favor of removing the board." The response was a primal roar. It was the sound of a community liberating itself. Nearly every hand in the room was raised. All opposed? Silence. Only Karen and her 2 cronies at the table kept their hands down. "The motion carries," David Chen announced into the stunned silence. "Karen Miller, you are hereby removed from the presidency of this association effective immediately. Please turn over all HOA property, including that gavel. Karen stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The color had drained completely from her face. She was no longer a field marshal. She was just a middle-aged woman in a turquoise polo shirt, stripped of her imaginary power. Without a word, she stood up, knocked over her chair, and fled the room. Her two cronies scurried out behind her like rats from a sinking ship. A wave of applause and cheers erupted in the clubhouse. People were shaking my hand, clapping me on the back. Mrs. Gable gave me a hug, her eyes wet with tears of relief. Arthur Finch, looking 10 years younger, was already talking with Mr. Martinez and several other homeowners about forming an interim board. The coup was complete. The tyrant had been deposed. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The interim board, with Arthur Finch as the new president, immediately voided every fine Karen had issued in the past year. Their first official act was to draft a formal letter of apology to me, which they delivered in person, along with a check for $500 for the damages to my garden. The forensic audit uncovered the full extent of Karen's embezzlement, which totaled over $50,000. The findings were turned over to the district attorney's office, and criminal charges were filed. To pay for her legal fees and the restitution demanded by the court, Karen Miller and her husband were forced to sell their house. The last I saw of her, she was packing her things into a moving van, her face a permanent mask of sour resentment. The house was bought by a young family who immediately erected a swing set in the backyard. The entire atmosphere of the neighborhood changed. It was like a fog had lifted. Basketball hoops reappeared. People planted flowers that weren't on an approved list. Mrs. Gable's flock of flamingos grew to an impressive size. The estates at Whispering Creek began to feel less like a beige prison and more like a community. A few weeks later, the Martinezes hosted a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate their newfound freedom. They invited me as the guest of honor. I was hesitant at first. My solitude was a comfortable habit. But I went. I spent the afternoon talking with my neighbors, no longer as a field commander recruiting insurgents, but simply as a fellow resident. They saw me not as the strange old man from the farm, but as the man who had helped them take back their homes. Today, I am back in my garden. The new Brandywine tomato plants I planted are thriving, their stems thick and strong, already heavy with green fruit. The split-rail fence stands as it always has, a quiet testament to a boundary that is both physical and philosophical. The sounds from the neighborhood on the other side are different now. The laughter of children, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball, the buzz of a lawnmower not being operated under duress. The binder, Operation Verdant Fury, sits on a shelf in my study. Its mission is complete, its purpose served. I look out over my land, at the orderly rows of my garden, the ancient oaks, the shimmering pond. It is a peaceful kingdom, and I am reminded that sometimes the only way to protect a peace that is truly valuable is to be willing to wage a methodical, righteous, and overwhelming war. The tranquility I now enjoy was not given. It was earned, fought for not with weapons of steel, but with paper, persistence, and the simple, unshakable power of the truth.